Hello, everybody. Really grateful for everyone joining us today, and welcome. So I'm Jess Warner. I'm the Lived Experience Network Manager at NSPA, and I'm really excited to be joined by Iman Rafour, Becky Williams, and Dr Maria Michail from the University of Birmingham's Institute of Mental Health, who will be talking to us about their youth advisory boards and the work that they've been doing either as part of the youth advisory board or with the youth advisory board related to suicide prevention. So Iman is a member of the Youth Advisory Boards. Becky used to be a member and is now the Youth Involvement Officer. And Maria is an Associate Professor at the university and works closely with the group. So this webinar is part of our programme of events with a focus on challenging stigma related to suicide as part of our campaign around reducing stigma related to suicide. So really happy to have people with us today. What we're going to be doing today is we will be having a short presentation from Maria. Then we're going to have a bit of a chat with Maria, Iman and Becky. And then we'll open up for some questions from you through the Q&A function. So this webinar is going to be about an hour and a half long, so we should be finished by around 11:30. We are recording today, so hopefully if there's people who have missed this webinar, we will be able to share the recording shortly on our website as well. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves in a chat. Our lovely NSPA colleagues, Heather, Juliet, Rosie and Mari, will be monitoring the chat. I'm not great at multitasking, so I might struggle to keep looking at the chat, but they will be monitored by our lovely colleagues at NSPA. And whilst we really do welcome you to write in the chat, please do remember to be respectful to each other and sensitive around the topic. And this does include, maybe not sharing details around means and methods related to suicide or details that other people might find distressing. So just if you can have a little bit of sensitivity around that. If you have questions for the panel at any time, please use the Q&A function, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. If anybody needs a hand working that out, do get in touch on the chat, and someone in the team should be able to help you. And I guess lastly, and really importantly, please do look after yourselves during the session. We are going to be talking about suicide and suicide prevention. People may be drawing on parts of their lived experience related to that. And I know some of us may have, some people might be quite used to talking about this topic, some people may not be. I think regardless, it's really important that people are, doing what works for you and what you might need during the session today, whether that means taking a step out if you need to. I think somebody in a team will just pop some numbers in a chat if anybody does need to talk to anybody for today as well. So I think that is everything. Maybe if somebody wants to shout at me if there's anything I've missed that's really important. But I think for now, I am going to hand over to Maria to do a short presentation before we have a bit of a chat as a group.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jess. We are delighted to be here with you today, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. As Jess said, my name is Maria Michail. I'm an associate professor within the Institute for Mental Health at the University of Birmingham, where I lead the self-harm and suicide prevention research program. I'll just be giving a little bit of information about the work that we do. So as I mentioned, I lead the self-harm and suicide prevention research program within the Institute for Mental Health. This is an interdisciplinary program of work with different types of subject and methodological expertise, but most importantly, putting young experts by experience at the front and center of our research. So the work that I'll present to you today is an example of a hopefully good example of practice in terms of co-production and how we can meaningfully involve young people with lived experience in suicide prevention research. There we go. We've got the slides. Thank you, Jess. So we can We can skip that, Jess, and go further down. We're not going to do the poll. There we go. So our focus of work is on suicide prevention, and one of the strands is around optimizing the role of primary care in suicide prevention. We know that suicide prevention may be considered an issue for specialist mental health services. However, given that many of the determinants of suicide lie at the heart of social adversity, such as unemployment, poverty, socioeconomic disadvantage, there is a strong need for the shared role and responsibility between health, social care, the voluntary sector, the justice system. So within this multifaceted approach, public health approach to suicide, we highlight the vital role of primary care. We know that GPs are the first and last healthcare contact for those who die by suicide. We know that they're a trusted source of help seeking for mentally ill health in young people. And we know that young people aged 16 to 24 visit their GP the most to seek help for self-harm. Next slide, please. So our program of research spans for the past 10 years. We've started on by exploring GPs' experiences of assessing and managing suicide risk in primary care. We did that qualitatively with GPs across East Midlands and also through a survey. We collected that intelligence, and then we were commissioned by the Royal College of GPs to develop an educational resource for GPs, what we call the top tips, to support them in the assessment and management of suicide risk. This resource sits on the Royal College of GP Mental Health Toolkit. It is open access and freely available for anyone to use. And then we disseminated in 2022 widely the educational resource, and then we evaluated with the GPs. And then at 2021, we've turned our attention to young people and exploring young people's experiences, because up until then, we didn't know much about young people's experiences in terms of seeking help of their GP when they're experiencing suicidal thoughts or feelings. And this is where, next slide, please. This is where the first thing that we got is get in contact with a youth advisory group. So what I'll be presenting you today is an example of youth partnership in suicide prevention research and practice. And when we hear about youth partnership in suicide prevention research, usually what we have associated this with is those three terms. It's unfeasible, risky, and potentially unsafe. There is a pervasive concern about the possibility of causing distress or even inducing suicidal thoughts and feelings. And such concerns are very commonly raised by health research committees, health and safety committees, sometimes even by researchers themselves. And this is more associated with their own confidence and skills in meaningfully involving young experts by experience in suicide prevention research. And these concerns are primarily associated with what we call a deficit-based approach, whereby we perceive young people to be vulnerable, weak, or needing protection. And of course, young people's safety is of paramount importance. And we do need to acknowledge that there might be safeguarding concerns that can limit the nature of involvement or involvement practices. However, we argue that the greater risk to young people is not being heard and not being included. We risk leaning too heavily on a safety discourse in a way that prevents us from collaboratively working together with young people to develop ways of carrying out co-production in an ethically, methodologically sound way. And by doing so, we run the risk of being unethical, exclusionary, and paternalistic. Next slide, please. So we provide today an example of co-production in suicide prevention research, which is drawn from our own program of work. And we do that while we are highlighting opportunities for maximizing the potential of partnering with young people, but also acknowledging some of the limitations and the challenges that we have faced as researchers in this process. And it's very important to be open and transparent about those challenges. This is not easy, it's not straightforward. So we describe how young people were involved in our research program, how this then had led to the development of my GP guide, and how young people were also involved in the dissemination and impact activities. Next slide, please. So this is our youth advisory group. This is I think 18 young people aged between 18 and 25 with lived or living experience of mental ill health or a strong interest in youth mental health, and also self-harm or suicidal behavior. It's an incredibly diverse group in terms of cultural representation and ethnic background, gender identity, and sexual orientation. We are lucky enough to have two substantive posts. One, the youth participation lead, Becky, which you've seen today, and you're going to hear more about it in a minute. But also Naya Campbell, who's our senior youth involvement officer. And these roles are incredibly important in terms of facilitating involvement and facilitating meetings between researchers and the youth advisory group, establishing the parameters of our involvement practices, and facilitating communication between researchers and the youth advisory group. Next slide, please. So our journey with the youth advisory group started with identifying research priorities when it comes from the perspective of young people, when it comes to suicide prevention in primary care. And one of the things that our young experts by experience have identified is that we don't know a lot about how, when, and why young people seek help from their GP when experiencing self-harm or suicidal thoughts or behaviors. So we embarked upon a study. It was a qualitative study, an in-depth qualitative study of young people's experiences of seeking help from their GP when experiencing self-harm or suicidal thoughts or behaviors. These were young people that were recruited from a youth mental health service in the UK. And the idea was to understand and conceptualize the processes underlying their help seeking prior, during, and following a GP consultation. So you can read a little bit more about this research, and I've included the citation there. But if we can skip to the next slide, I'm just going to very quickly summarize the findings of this study. So we found that help seeking is a very complex process, a very dynamic process, and there are different factors that can impact on help seeking prior, during, and after a GP consultation. Prior, for example, we found that many young people, it linked to young people's perception of GP as a source of help. I remember distinctively one of the quotes of one of our participants saying that I found myself in a waiting room full of people who were coughing and sneezing. And I was there because I was anxious and depressed. And I found myself questioning myself, why am I there? Is this the right place for me to seek help? So perceptions of a GP as a source of help and support for mental health experiences or suicidal experiences was something that influenced the young people's help seeking prior to a consultation. During a consultation, things such as how safe young people felt, feeling safe enough and supported to disclose distress, misconceptions sometimes about confidentiality and its limits and the implications of disclosing how young people felt. And after a GP consultation, young people would go back to their GP if they had a positive experience. If that was a positive experience, they were more likely to visit their GP again. We shared these findings with a youth advisory group in the hope that they would help us sort of interpret those findings and also the implications from those findings. And one of the things that they have highlighted in one of our consultations is that there are a lot of misconceptions among young people about the role of GP, which might prevent them from seeking help when they're feeling unwell. But also what they have highlighted is how there is not a lot of information that can support young people in seeking help from their GP. And next slide, please. And this is what young people have identified as a gap. Is they've identified that these findings give rise to the need to develop a resource for young people, developed by young people for young people, that would offer evidence-based, accessible, and practical tips to facilitate the GP consultation and facilitate young people's help seeking. So we embarked upon sort of over 6 months in this co-design process to design this guide. We had 4 online co-design workshops. This was during the COVID lockdown. So, quite tricky and challenging to organize these things, but we were very, very flexible in the way that young people were involved. For example, young people were very comfortable in speaking during the co-design process, the workshops. Some of them felt more comfortable in sharing their contributions via the chat function on Zoom. I had several meetings with young people outside of the main workshops. We used, emails and Jamboard, and you can see some of young people's contributions here on an online whiteboard that we used during our workshops. And it was a very iterative process, the way we designed the guide. So we started with a brainstorming session to understand how the young people's views about how the guide should look like and the basic content of the guide. This then led to the first draft of my GP guide, which young people have reviewed. We took their feedback on board and drafted the second version. And you can see a very iterative process until we received sort of final comments and feedback. But one of the things that young people identified, very cleverly, is that a guide can sit on a shelf or it can sit on an online workshop, on an online website. But how can we bring the guide to life in an engaging way? So what young people, your youth experts by experience, have identified is the opportunity to develop a short video to bring the guide to life. And therefore, we engaged with a graphic designer in order to do that. Next slide, please. So, and these are some of our things that have worked for us. So some processes that we have put in place before, during, and after our co-design workshops to ensure the safe and meaningful involvement of young people in this piece of work. To start with, we had very clearly defined terms of reference and ground rules, which we reiterated at the beginning and throughout each co-design workshop. These rules and terms of references were about highlighting the importance of confidentiality, but also its limits, and also anonymity, acknowledging and respecting different and complementary types of expertise within our group. For example, I've got years of research experience and methodological expertise, but I do not have lived experience. So it's about, if you think about it as a puzzle, is bringing all these pieces of puzzle together. Listening respectfully to one another, allowing the time and space to share their story, and also being very mindful of dominating discussions. And we all do that sometimes when we feel very passionate about things that are very close to our hearts. During the co-production workshops, we were very clear that we were not asking of young people to share any personal experiences, but it was more about drawing upon their lived or living experience to inform the development of my GP guide. As I've mentioned before, we were incredibly flexible in how young people shared their views and insights. we ensured what we call a circular flow of knowledge, and this is very, very important. This is a communication model that involves a continuous exchange of information between the research team and the youth advisory group. So, and it helps ensure transparency, avoiding misunderstandings or misinterpretation of young people's experiences and views. And very importantly, demonstrating how feedback informed the development of the guide. So, and it was very, very important that we couldn't take on board all feedback for many, many reasons. But what young people have identified as really important and they valued is the fact that we provided a rationale for when feedback could not be taken on board, and that ensured transparency. We had debriefing sessions with young people after each workshop, and for the research team, it was very, very important to have that what we call reflective practice. Next slide, please. So my GP guide was launched on World Suicide Prevention Day 2021, and you can scan this QR code to access the guide, which is available freely online, and the associated video. Next slide, please. And the guide is split into 3 sections, and this is what young people thought it was important to break it down into sizable chunks. So we have before, before, during, and after your GP consultation. And you can see now some snippets of the guide with young people's quotes. So the next session, please, next slide, please. So here, for example, we have things that young people could be mindful of before their visit to, before they visit their GP. Things such as, for example, bringing someone with them to support them. Next slide, please. Safety planning is something that has come out of our research findings, and something also that young people, young experts by experience, were very keen that we include in the guide. And that stems from the fact that many young people do not know what a safety plan is and how the GP can help and support them. So if we play the video now, you can see how we've incorporated that.
Ask your GP to help you make a plan to keep you safe. This is called the safety plan. You can discuss with your GP any behaviours, feelings, situations or events that can trigger a suicidal crisis, and any coping strategies, resources or actions that you can use before or during a suicidal crisis that can make you feel better. A safety plan can also include a list of professionals or agencies you can contact during a crisis. You can write down your safety plan, take a copy with you, and use it whenever you feel you need to.
Wonderful. And in the next slide, you're going to hear the experience of developing a safety plan with her GP.
Keeping you safe.
Sometimes I felt so lost in my emotions that I struggled to know what to do. Making a safety plan with my doctor really helped me to navigate times like that, and I stuck it on my bedroom wall and took a picture of it on my phone, so wherever I went I could use some of the strategies on there. It was really helpful and not something that I could have done on my own.
Wonderful. And another example of a guide, the next slide, is around confidentiality. We found that many young people were not clear about confidentiality and the implications of disclosure. So we've tackled that head on by providing information about confidentiality and its limits. And you can hear more about this in the video.
It is important to know that what you say to your GP is confidential. However, there might be cases where your GP has to share information with other professionals, for example, when they are trying to get you the best help you need. Another example is when your GP thinks you might be at risk of death or serious harm. If your GP has to share information about you, they will ask for your consent first, and they will tell you what information exactly they will share, with whom and why. You have to be mindful, however, that your GP might still have to share information about you without your consent. Although this might be upsetting, Please remember that your GP has your best interest at heart and they want to do the right thing to keep you safe.
Wonderful, thank you. And the next slide, we included some information, again, a part of the guide about what happens after your GP visit. So many young people would find the courage to go and see their GP and discuss their problems, but they were not quite sure what happens after a GP consultation. So again, the guide includes information about important things that could happen after the GP consultation and also important things to keep in mind in general. And next slide, please. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I think this is something that we're going to tackle in the Q&A session, but we have embarked upon a wide sort of dissemination and outreach activities to ensure that the guide reaches the key beneficiaries. So the guide has been used by the Welsh education sector now as a critical resource for supporting young people's emotional health and well-being. It's been adopted by many sort of health authorities, primary care, and we've also written with and BMJ open commentary about the process for developing the GP guide, and that was co-written with one of our, Jamie Morgan, one of our youth advisors. If you scan the QR code, it will take you to the paper, which is open access. Next slide, please. One of the, however, of our sort of notable achievements of the Youth Advisory Group, and I cannot not mention that, it was an honorary mention as part of the 2024 EU Prize for Citizen Science. So this is an annual competition which is open across all European countries. And the idea is to highlight the importance of citizen science in research. So the Youth Advisory Group with my GP guide were one of the 27 projects across Europe to receive an honorary mention. You can have a look at the jury statement, which has highlighted that this initiative exemplifies meaningful youth engagement in driving mental health advocacy and systemic change. And this is this is an accolade that our youth experts by experience are incredibly proud, and so it should be. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I think it's important to highlight that we cannot eliminate risk, but we can put in place robust processes that would help researchers mitigate those risks. So safety protocols and procedures that are co-produced with young people, and we have published many of those. You can access those through this QR code. I cannot highlight enough the important role of a youth participation lead, not just in supporting young people, but also researchers during the co-production process. For researchers, training, supervision, and reflective practice is incredibly important. And when we were designing my GP guide, we didn't have any guidelines on how to go about doing this, but now we do. So these guidelines that you can see at the lower left, right hand corner, that the team at the University of Melbourne have developed with young people to ensure the safe and effective involvement of young people with lived and living experience in suicide prevention research. And I would like to finish by acknowledging and thanking the Youth Advisory Group. And you can see the names of all the youth experts by experience that were involved in this process in the next slide. Very, very big thank you to Romel, Lizzie, Jamie, Iman, Kaylin, Charlie, and Becky. Our senior youth involvement and engagement lead, Naya Campbell, and our youth participation lead now, ex-Youth Advisory Group member, Becky Williams. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And I know we've got some questions in a Q&A, which we will come to after we've had a bit of a chat with you, Becky, and Iman. So thank you, everybody, for your questions, and do keep them coming. I will just say, if we're not able to answer everybody's questions, we will take a note of them all and and talk to Becky, Iman, and Maria to see if we can come back and over, over email in other ways as well. But thank you so much, Maria. And I think the first, because I think it's really great now to be joined by Iman and Becky as well. And I know, I know Maria, you spoke, you spoke a lot about the group and the members in the group. So I guess the first thing I want to do is come to Iman. And I think it'd be really good to hear from you, Iman, as a member of the youth advisory group, to just say a little bit about your experiences of being part of the group.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. My name's Iman, and I joined the YAG back in 2018, and I was approached for this opportunity through my college at the time. So when I joined the YAG, I didn't really know what to expect because it was the first time I had heard about such an organization, and I quickly molded into the routines and role of the YAG. Because the environment, although it was professional, it was always very welcoming. And it was a place to have open discussions about the cracks in our system, which we may not have had a platform, maybe as young people, to discuss this on. Yeah.
Thank you, Iman. And I imagine some of the conversations that you may have had as a group may have been quite sensitive. And, I work with lots of people with lived experience sort of navigating some of those sensitivities as well. And I think Maria touched on it a little bit, but I wondered if we could hear from your perspective a bit about sort of how as a group you've navigated around, some of those sensitivities and what you've done to, I guess, help everybody feel safe in that space.
Yeah, I mean, the majority of the meetings and discussions we have are around sensitive topics. But what's good is that over the years, the YAG have had an understood set of rules, whether it be for the GP guide or whether it be for any other kind of research. Things such as pre and post meeting briefs with Naya, or now Becky, creating a safe space to discuss sensitive topics and understanding that we are talking about certain topics which can be triggering to other people. Saying that having no requirement to share personal experiences, and also having co-leads such as Naya and Becky to act as buffers between young people and researchers, but also to just have as kind of like a support system for young people themselves, not just during the meetings, but after the meetings, a week after the meeting, 2 weeks after the meeting. We've been lucky enough as the YAG to not constantly have to go through these set of rules, as the young people understand them from the onset. So as a group, we're very lucky that whether it be the original people who joined or people who joined along the way, we've always had this understanding that we're trying to create a safe environment for young people to speak on, and understanding that people are speaking or can be speaking from really, really sensitive places, and just understanding that in general creates rules, understood rules within itself.
Thank you, Iman. There's something there that's speaking to me about, I guess, the trust within and between the group and that kind of shared understanding with that as well. Thank you, Iman. Maria, I can see you've popped your hand up. I didn't know if there's something you wanted to.
Very quickly to interject, one of the things that I think was very important is to have what we call safety plans or wellness plans with each young advisor, youth advisor, before the co-production process. And that involved helping us understand a little bit more about their own experiences, potential triggers, a support person that we could contact if they get upset or uncomfortable during a session. And having those at hand during the process, I think is something that helped us a lot.
Thank you, Maria. And Aman, there was something as well that you said around, that there's no expectation for people to share personal experiences. I think that's something that always chimes through for me and a lot of people I work with as well with lived experience, that people can share their perspectives without having to share all of their experiences, and it's really important people have space. So thank you for sharing that as well. Okay, Becky, your name's popped up quite a bit so far. Don't know if you've noticed.
Yeah.
And I know, you were part of the youth advisory group, and now you're one of the leads, and that sounds like a really important role, as Aman's mentioned, as Maria's mentioned. I wondered if you wanted to just share a little bit about, I guess, your experiences of both being part of the advisory group yourself and then coming into your role now, and a bit
Yeah,
about.
sure. So, in terms of when I joined when the YAG kind of conceptually started. So I think it was about the same time that Aman joined, because I'm pretty sure we joined at near enough the same time, but I'm awful at thinking back all that way ago. But it was one of the first youth advisory groups where I actually felt like we were on the same level as the researchers and like the members of the team. It was very much like a level playing field in comparison to some of the other youth groups that I've been a part of, where you could really kind of feel the difference between you, the young person, versus like the researchers or the people who are coming in to ask for the kind of advice on certain topics. So for me, it was the kind of eye-opening for me as a personal like experience of, okay, so this is how like youth groups should work, and how the kind of co-production element should kind of work, and that's kind of what drove me to decide to continue to stay in this kind of like workspace and then take the role as the lead, because it was very interesting to see over time as I like continue to participate within this YAG, which by the way, YAG stands for Youth Advisory Group, because there's so many acronyms that I understand that they're a little bit like, what is this? But it was, for me, it was the reason that I kept doing it and then decided to do it like as a job, was because I realized from my own personal experiences that when I was interacting with this YAG versus some of my other youth groups that I was a part of when I was a bit younger, there was a distinct difference between the way that they were kind of organized and the kind of the kind of like relationship level between the researchers and like the team versus the young people. And this YAG just felt more of a cohesive, like everyone's on the same platform and we're all doing this to kind of get like a better sense of like how to improve the spaces that we work in.
Thank you for sharing that. And there is something about, I think, when you experience it yourself and experience being part of that, and then you have a buy-in that actually it's you felt well supported. It sounds like there's been a lot of thought that's been put into that, but the sense I'm getting, I know when we were planning for this as well, the meetings that I had with you, Becky, you, Iman, and with you, Maria, of kind of, there wasn't that sort of super hierarchical feel to
Yes.
it. That's the sense I got anyway.
Yeah, completely. That's what we really try, like within the structure, to make sure that when new members come in, because we did a recent like recruitment drive, and so there's a whole bunch of new young people who have only ever seen me as the lead rather than Naya as the lead. So it's been, for me, like one of the main things that I've been trying to focus on is ensuring that we don't end up with this kind of, as you said, like a hierarchical kind of structure. Like everyone's all here for the same reason and we're all trying to achieve the same goal. So there's no need for this kind of like hierarchical structure within it, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Becky. I imagine that the group, people knowing that you were in the YAG yourself, it also has, you know, has an impact on how you're able to relate to each other. And I know in my role, I have to have lived experience to do my role as a lived experience network manager in NSPA, and there is something about how we, you know, how we might draw on that or refer to
Yeah.
it as well.
I definitely think it helps having the kind of connection to having been a member, because there was a recent event that we do pretty much every year, where we invite some YAG members to come and do like a teaching of a module about the GP guide actually. And one of the things that was very easy for me was to explain how the finance stuff works, because it's different to how we typically do it. And I was able to say, well, when I was a YAG member and I did this project like 2 years ago, I had to do da 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 da. And so it can help sometimes to have that kind of connection. And I think when you were talking about like the level of trust that we have like as a group, I think it helps to add to that level of trust, because it's not like a random person's come in and is now trying to like enforce like a safe space, but without having any understanding of how the safe space kind of functions, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's definitely some perks to having been through it yourself.
A lot of sense, thank you. And I know, Maria, when you were talking in the presentation about that, I guess that transparency, I guess the question I had for all three of you, I'm going to come to Maria first, and then I'd really love to hear from Iman and Becky. I guess hearing a little bit about some of the challenges that you might have encountered. It's going to be quite a brief question though, because I think challenges is a really positive thing to talk about. I just wondered if there were any challenges that you wanted to share with people here today, and sort of how you overcame them. And I'll come to you first, Maria, and then Iman and Becky.
Yes, thank you, Jess. That's a very, very important question. And it's, you know, you can see things as challenges, or you can see these things as, you know, opportunities for growth as well. But I think the fact that it was a first substantial co-design project with a youth advisory group that I had done. And it was during the COVID lockdown. So under sort of normal circumstances, we would have opted for a face-to-face workshop, where I think some of the practicalities and logistics are easier to manage. And also some of the safety, perhaps sort of safeguarding concerns were easier to manage. Not that there were any on this occasion. So the fact that it was online added an extra sort of layer of complexity. And that's why, in order to address this particular challenge, so I worked very closely with Naya at that point to understand the group. There were some young people that I hadn't worked with before. To understand young people's sort of experiences. I spoke to the youth advisors in advance to understand their needs and preferences and motivations for being involved in this program of work. And also any issues that they would like me to be aware of that might influence their participation in any way. So this was one of the challenges. It was a territory that we hadn't tapped on before because of what was happening in the world at that point in time.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. I'm just remembering the time when everything moved to online and thinking, how are we? I was very used to working with people in person, sort of thinking, how are we going to manage the safety element? Thank you, Maria. Becky or Iman, do either or both of you have anything that you want to share around challenges? And that could be personal, your own experiences related to the group, or it could be just generally what you've experienced in a group. Or Iman, I can see your mic's on.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the GP guide was one of the first projects that we did as a YAG that was quite long and ongoing, and we would come back to it constantly. And it was one of the first projects that I personally did with the YAG that spoke about such a sensitive topic. And I feel like at times often things conversations can be triggering and conversations can be really, really difficult to be had, not only because we were talking about suicide preventions, but because we were talking about GPs. And as a YAG, we kind of all came to a conclusion that we haven't had the best experiences with GPs. And that was basically the project on how to improve that. But we were speaking on memory, and we were coming up with ideas, being like, oh, this happened to me. And then someone would say, oh, this happened to me. And I feel like those conversations would be difficult to have. I feel like if we would have done the GP guide now, personally, I would have been much stronger in doing it. But at the time, because it was one of the first projects, for me personally, to speak on such a sensitive topic and to have it be so ongoing, like we would, as Maria said, it shifted from in person to online, and we came back to it constantly. So it would just be constantly coming back to, you know, that topic. But I feel like, as Maria said, as she was speaking, I remembered that we actually did do this with the GP guide, where we had individual kind of conversations to be like, how can the youth lead at the time, who was Naya, and Maria, notice that you are struggling or you are being triggered without you actually openly saying, okay, I'm being triggered right now, I need to leave. How could we have that? And I remember having those conversations with our youth leads, and that was something to overcome that barrier. And I think we use that again and again and again in different researches, and it just became something that, okay, now, and that was something that we kind of created that bond that we're talking about with like Becky and with Naya, and how comfortable we are, because I think, as Becky said, because she was a YAG member before, now that she is a youth lead, a youth officer, I'm sorry, I don't know the right term, I get confused, but we have that because we know she's experienced that, the same things that we're experiencing. And with Naya, I think it's just because personalities clicked at the time, and the YAG's personality clicked at the time, that we could have that open conversation that, okay, this might be triggering to me. Sorry if I completely went off topic.
Apologize for it all. I don't think you were going off topic whatsoever. And there's something that you're saying there, is that there was, you know, quite an emotional challenge in, and it also sounded like quite a lot of learning came from that, and learning collectively as a group, which is, I think, quite a profound experience. Sometimes we go, oh, all of it, people might get upset, as an example, but actually how you worked through that, and it really shows the importance of you know, the thinking around it and learning together. So thank you for sharing that, Iman. Becky, do you have anything briefly to add?
I'll try and be as brief as I can, and if you need to make me stop talking to move on, just like tell me and I'll stop. But I think from a personal perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges that I saw, or like I still see as a current like ongoing issue, is just the level of funding that's kind of provided to do this kind of work in a whole. And I say this from both perspectives, having been, you know, the young person involved in the kind of like role, and then also now becoming the role and seeing both sides of it. Because the role initially, when Naya started it, the funding was only for a part-time position, and then eventually there was funding to have it as a full-time position before it's now been downgraded again to the part-time position that I now have. So in terms of like the way that the funding system kind of works for these kind of like roles, so like everyone has the kind of understanding and the acknowledgement of, we should do this work, it's really important to do. But then I feel on a broader scale, it's like everyone thinks, yes, this is good, but then no one kind of puts aside the money for it, or seems to assume that people who have like generic roles will be able to just tack on a little hour here or a little hour there to do this kind of like extra additional work, and then everything will come together. And it became very evident to me when I was involved with this YAG, that the reason that this YAG works so well is because there is a person who does the job that I now do. to be the kind of middleman between the young people and also like the researchers, because it's like having a person in your corner as the young people. And I think it's a really valuable role. And I think in terms of like on a global, whether it be grant funding scale, there's just a kind of oh, we definitely need to do PPI work, but then no one puts aside the either allocates the time or the resources for it. It's just kind of well, you got to do it, but no one gives them the the ability to be able to do it. So I think for me, that's like one of the biggest challenges that I've seen happening. I'm not entirely sure of specifically how you solve that, but that's kind of the biggest one that I've seen.
I hear you, and I can really relate to that challenge. Because there is something about if we're really valuing this, then we need to be able to resource it.
Yeah.
To do it properly. Yeah. Thank you, Becky. Okay, in the last few minutes before we go into some questions for people who've been joining us in the audience today have been asking in the Q&A, I had, I think, one last question for each of you. And it was really just thinking about the impact that your work, either with the youth advisory group or as part of a youth advisory group, what impact has that had on you or your work? And I'm gonna ask you each just to share one main thing. I know there could be loads of impact. And I'm gonna come to Maria first.
Thank you, Jess. I think it's important to clarify that impact is ongoing, and you know, PPI work, specifically when you're working with young people, sometimes it takes a while before you can see meaningful changes. However, what we have tried to do with the help of the Youth Advisory Group is disseminate the guide as widely as possible. So across different settings. So in primary care, my GP guide has now reached approximately 300 practices of approximately 2,000 GPs. Health authorities in England have used, for example, in Derby, have used the My GP Guide as an example of good practice. It sits on their website. And the Welsh government have also used My GP Guide, which has been disseminated in all schools across Wales as a critical resource for emotional health and support. Now, very importantly, we're now using My GP Guide as a teaching tool, as an example to teach about the importance of youth involvement in research. And Becky has talked about before that we've used it to teach medical students, but also a very, very new initiative now is that we are working with our educational leads within the Institute of Mental Health to include My GP Guide as part of the curriculum for the mental health, the distance learning MSc in mental health. So this is something that I'll be working closely with colleagues to incorporate that as part of a sort of teaching resource.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria. Iman, can I come to you next?
A personal impact or achievement I'd like to mention is, I think working with the YAG has opened opportunities of travel for me. I've been able to go to London and Oxford and even Denmark with the YAG to be able to kind of showcase the work that we've done, not just in different research studies. And I think that's something that I'm like very proud of, and something that I like to mention when I talk about the YAG, because I think it's something that's quite overlooked with the YAG. The fact that we're able to actually travel and not only nationally but internationally to showcase our work. Yeah.
Thank you, Iman. It's lovely to see how much you're smiling when you were talking about that as well. It sounds quite exciting to be able to travel internationally as well. And Becky.
I will also do another personal kind of like impact. I think when I joined the YAG way back when, I kind of had the assumption personally of like I thought I knew what I wanted to do permanently for the, for like as a job, and being involved in the YAG and being in that space and learning about how research can have a genuine, like, life-changing impact on people made me kind of change my own perspective about what I thought I'd do as a job, and has very much pushed me towards this line of work that I currently do, and also towards trying to strive to get to a PhD. That's kind of where I'm hoping to get to be able to do my own kind of little research project. So yeah, in terms of like as a personal impact, it was impactful in a very positive way to kind of change my perspective to understand how I can kind of, yeah.
That sounds amazing. Thank you, Becky. And it's interesting, I think, hearing from the kind of the wider impact. I think it's so important we're thinking about the wider impact of something, but also, yeah, how that's impacted all of us personally. So it's really wonderful to hear about that from all of your perspectives. So we've got some questions in a Q&A box, so I'm going to come to those. If people have put a question we don't have time to answer it, I apologise in advance, but we will then talk to Becky, Iman and Maria to see if we can get them answered afterwards. I'm not gonna necessarily ask them in order either, but there's a couple of quite practical questions I want to come to first because I think they might be quicker. We could maybe quickly answer that. And one is from Alina asking if there are, I'm going to ask them both at the same time, if there are printed copies available to order, or is it only online copies that are online to download? And there was another question from Brian asking, are all GP surgeries and NHS trusts aware of My GP Guide?
I'm happy to take that question, Jess, if that's okay. So the first one, no, we don't have printed copies. I think primarily because of sustainability, but the guide is free to access online, and so is the video, which sits within the University of Birmingham website, but also it's on YouTube as well. So you're more than welcome to access those, but we cannot provide printed copies. With regards to reach of GP practices, not all GPs have access to it. That's why we are trying to disseminate the guide as widely as possible. Most of our dissemination took place in the West Midlands, just because of practicalities and logistics. But if there are any ways that you can help us reach GP practices outside of our region, please do let us know. That will be extremely helpful.
Nearly forgot to unmute myself then. Thank you, Maria. And actually, yeah, so a call out to anybody, feel free to pop in a chat, or I mean, does anybody have, perhaps if there's some contact details, if anybody does want to get in touch, if they've had some ideas, if Maria or Becky, you want to pop that in a chat.
Put them on the chat.
Yeah. Because I think I'm imagining there'll be people from other regions who have got some strong links with GPs and might want to help get that word out there. And following on from that, there's a question from Robert, just asking how, I'm going to reword it slightly, but I guess sometimes information might change. And Robert was asking about how information is kept updated in a GP guide. If do you go and review it and update it every so often, or is it as it is?
Do you want me just to?
Do you want to? Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So we haven't updated the guide yet, but we are reaching now the point because of the evolving nature of young people's needs, but very importantly, the evolving sort of landscape of primary care. It is very important that the guide is being updated. So I will be very soon knocking the door again of the youth advisory group to work with them towards an updated version of the guide.
Thank you, Maria. Okay. So next, another question is from an anonymous person, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know, Becky, if you've got insight into this to start with, and Iman might want to share their experiences too. And it's, how did you recruit for the youth advisory group and ensure the opportunity reached as many people as
Oh,
possible?
I can totally do this because I just did this when I started. Actually, it was one of the first things that I had the control of, was doing the second round of recruit. Well, technically third, but I call it second because when the second one happened, I was in the States doing my year abroad when COVID started. So I missed the second round of recruitment. So I always end up calling it second, but it's technically third. But the way that it works is that the youth lead, I'm going to refer to myself as a third person because it's easier to explain, but the youth lead would create a basically a Microsoft Forms that the young people can fill out, which just gives some very basic information. So like your name and where you're based, which I know some people might argue about the importance of putting where you're based, but it's important for this because sometimes when we do in-person events, we need to know how far away people are traveling from, and that's really important to know. So that's why that kind of question's in there. We don't ask anything that requires you to put down any of your lived experience or detail any reason as to why you'd be eligible in a certain aspect like that. There's no like, tell us why you think you'd be great for this. But we do ask for some questions like about why you were interested in the opportunity. How would you like to be engaged? Like, would you want to do meetings? Because we explain in the application, like, so what typically happens is it's the second Tuesday and Wednesday of the second of every month. So the second week of every month is Tuesday, Wednesday, and then the next Tuesday, Wednesday is when the YAG meetings would happen. So we kind of, in the recruitment ad, explain this is the typical thing that happens, and this is typically how meetings are held, to give the person who's filling in the advertisement to understand if that's how they'd want to engage, and if not, they can explain how they would prefer to engage, so that we can try and include everyone within it. And in terms of how we try and ensure it's reached as many young people as possible, this is why Naya has been kind of elevated to a different role so that we can kind of get some more engagement / outreach going on. So my job now is solely around the kind of administration and dealings with the YAG and making sure that meetings happen and that we have the meetings and that researchers can be allocated to the meeting slots, etc. And Naya's entire kind of thing about this now is to kind of promote in the community aspect. So when we did this round of recruitment, they went to a couple of different very large like community events that were held in Birmingham to advertise the opportunity that way in the community. And it's something that we are really trying to like advertise outside of the university space as well as within the university space, because we are aware of and don't want to become a purely university based kind of YAG, if that makes sense. So we do try our best to reach out to the local community and make sure that they're aware of the opportunity at the bare minimum.
Thank you, Becky. And Aman, no pressure if you don't, if you're not sure, but is there anything you wanted to add about your experience of kind of, I guess, going through the recruitment process into the YAG?
It was so long ago that I'm a bit, but I do remember it was through my college. I hadn't even started at the University of Birmingham yet, and the opportunity came through my college, and I just applied, and I got a call from Naya, and we had a bit of a chat, like how everything that Becky said that's on the form now, I just had a chat like that with Naya, and then we had this inauguration type thing where I met Becky and everyone, and that's how it kind of, I think it was simpler in those days, and because of tech and everything shifting to online now, it's become more and more techy, but before it was just like a simple phone call and conversation, and that was it, I guess.
We do still call them, but we did the form because we ended up, the reason that Naya did the calls initially, and that this is some context, I apologize. So in the first round of recruitment that Iman's talking about, Naya wasn't sure about how many applicants they'd get, and they got a lot more than any one person could kind of deal with in an efficient timescale. So the reason that the questions moved on to the form was so when we got the 50 plus applications that we got this time, we were able to go through them with a little bit more of efficiency. We still called everyone on that list, but it just meant that we had kind of a basis of what to base the conversation that we could have with them, rather than going in completely blind, if that makes sense. Yeah, sorry, just a little bit of context.
Do you have this is a question for me, I'm cheating here, aren't I? Just to add to that, is there so do you have a I guess when NSPA are recruiting lived experience influencers, for example, like we don't have a limit of how many people can be on our wider panel.
Yeah.
We do have a limit in how many people can be on our training, or if we're doing an advisory group. Do you have, is it a sort of set number?
We don't have a set number, but it's kind of a more self-imposed one of we've the current number that we currently have, and there are some that are currently not participating due to circumstances of their own, but the total number of YAG members is 21 at this current moment. And I think we're, in terms of active participants at this current moment, I think we're at 18 because of other circumstances that are going on. So there's not really a specific limit, but more of we as I say we as the team, I mean me and Naya, kind of like have an idea of how much is too much in this specific group setting. So we kind of, I think the maximum we'd ever probably have would be about 25, and that's because we know that there's a lot of flexibility within our group about when people can participate. So there's sometimes periods where people will be just completely off the grid for 6 months, and they'll say like, I'm just focusing on university, I'll be back when I'm done with this exam or whatever like that. So the flexibility like that means we can technically have more members than the traditional kind of YAG setup of like 10 solid members because of that kind of flexibility, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. It's quite similar to how we approach things with lived experience influencers at NSPA. And actually, a lot of people say that they really appreciate that flexibility, that someone can say, actually,
Yeah,
I'm going through a difficult time at the moment, I'm going to take a step out, but I don't want to leave completely. Because
we get that all the time. Yeah, it was huge, especially for me, like as personally, when I was a young member and I knew that I was going abroad to the States, I knew that I'd be gone for at least a year in terms of actual things. So I just told Naya at the time, like, I have this and I'm not going to be in the country, so I can't participate for a year. And he was like, yeah, no worries, just like message me when you're back and we'll get you put back in the email chain. And I was at the time like mind blown that it was genuinely just that simple, and all I had to do was email him and be like, I'm back.
Thank you, Becky. There's a few questions from Drew, all really interesting questions. Drew, if you're still with us, we might not be able to answer all of them, but I do want to, there's some really interesting ones here. So one of the questions is, I'm going to ask two of them together. So in your opinion, and this can go to Maria, Becky, Iman, all of you, whoever wants to answer this really, in your opinion, what are the main differences or things to keep in mind when working specifically with young people? And I'm guessing, that might be in comparison to people of all ages. And then another question I think links nicely to this is, do you think young people can be added to a mixed age group, or does that change the dynamics? I have views on that as well, so I might chip in, but please, Maria, Becky, or Iman, your
Can
thoughts?
start the ball rolling, and then if people want to hop in afterwards, that's totally fine. But in terms of the main differences or things to like keep in mind when doing lived experience work with young people, I think a lot of it is about just being understanding and being flexible. And I think when I was I keep saying when I was a young person, like I'm not 25, but when I was actively participating within that space, the flexibility and the kind of way that this YAG went about engaging young people is what made me stay. And from my own experiences, the other groups that I left were because of the rigidity of the way that they ran their structures, that meant that I was unable to fully participate and therefore felt like I wasn't validated, or like that my participation wasn't valued enough. So that was one of the reasons why I stopped participating in some of those other ones. So I think for me, it's about having an understanding about the flexibility and like an understanding of the experiences that that young person has gone through and also probably is still going through. And the flexibility is something that like is like a godsend in some respects for being able to participate and still feel valued. And then the other thing about mixed age groups is I think it very much, from a personal experience of both leading and being a part of, it's very much dependent upon how wide said age range is, and kind of like what content within that group you're asking. I think it's a two-folded. I know that's a very kind of not answer, but I think that's kind of the way it is. It's very much a case of you'd have to go as a case by case of looking at specifically what the group age range is, but then also what the content it is that you'd be asking that group, as a kind of thing. And I think in certain circumstances that would change the dynamics and would mean that you'd have to probably edit some of the structure of the way you do things.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, what I'm hearing there is probably, I would echo this as well, is that it depends on the context. Yeah. Thank you, Becky. Iman or Maria, did you have anything to add?
I'm just happy about the second question, just to mention that we are focusing on the 18 to 25 age group. I think by doing that, sadly, we're excluding a group of young people who might be in need and whose voices are usually excluded from research. So we do need to acknowledge that and look into that in more detail. But I do think that when you're involving younger children, there are many things that need to be taken into consideration. For example, age-appropriate methods for safely and meaningfully involving young children, child-friendly ways that will be very, very different to how you would involve young people sort of over the age of the 18 to 25 age group, which are mostly working with. So these are important considerations. There are a number of sort of logistics and complexities when you are involving younger children in participatory work. But I do think as an organization it's something that we need to look into more carefully. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, and I mean, if it's okay for me to add, I think there's something about, I've worked with groups of not under 18, but of mixed age groups. And I think it is, like Becky said, it depends on the context. There's also huge learning that bringing people together with different experiences like can come from that as well. But I guess it depends on what the purpose of a group is and what, like it might change the dynamics, doesn't mean it's better or worse. So that would be my understanding. I don't know what other
I would
people.
agree completely. It's very much a context situational based upon the group and what its aims are to achieve 100%.
Yeah. And I guess that comes back to your point, Becky, about flexibility as well. Because I just think that is I think it's just a good way of thinking about when involving anyone. I mean, some of us have really complicated lives and things, that flexibility it can be really important, but being clear about what that can and cannot include is,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's one of the things that I've tried to make kind of evident when I because obviously because the group is 21 and so the YAG meetings have like a limit of how many YAG members can attend in a meeting, because obviously 21 people in one meeting would be a lot of voices. So there are like deadlines to submit like the interest of forms for young members to say like I want to be involved in this meeting or not in this one, and that kind of thing. But again, it's not like if you haven't applied by this deadline, you can't do any of them. And so that's the kind of thing that I find this YAG does that other YAGs didn't, that I was a part of, that made me stop participating, So yeah, the flexibility is 100% like a key. And I think sometimes not intentionally, but it's just the forgotten element that people kind of forget when they're making like this kind of space and trying to be inclusive, is that including the flexibility within that kind of understanding is really important, especially when you're engaging like young members with lived current or past lived experience. the rigidity just isn't gonna work for long-term, like, valuable engagement.
Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. I can see some other questions in the chat that I think we might be able to come back to you outside of this, if that's okay. But the last question we're going to ask is it's from Clive, and it's how can we best combat long-term or challenge in our immediate conversations? So this question actually came quite early on. I think might have been whilst Maria was doing the presentation. So how can we combat the view that workers in primary care will increase the risk of suicide by asking young people about suicidal thoughts or behaviours? So I guess it's that, or if you ask, you might put it in someone's head. How do we challenge or combat that assumption?
I'm happy to take that, Jess, or to start with, if that's okay. So yeah, this is a widely held sort of myth and misconception. And when we train GPs, this is something that sometimes comes up. I think there's actually been a concerted effort by the scientific community to build the evidence base against this misconception. So we now have very robust evidence demonstrating that asking about self-harm or suicidal experiences does not increase risk, does not induce suicidal thoughts. It might temporarily and in the very short term increase levels of distress, and this is understandable. We are talking about very sensitive issues, but that does not mean that there is a long-term impact apart from a short-term increase in distress. There have been many studies now that have evaluated the involvement of young people at the end of the study, of where they had to talk about suicidal experiences or taking part in suicide prevention research. Our very good colleagues at the University of Nottingham, Joe Lockwood, has conducted research in schools. I think it was secondary schools. And their evaluation of youth involvement demonstrated absolutely no evidence to suggest that talking about suicide within the school context or asking young people to be involved in this type of research increases risk. And it's the same exactly in primary care. On the contrary, what it does do, and what young people from our research have told us, is that it gives them an opportunity to share. Many young people said no one has ever asked. So asking actually gives young people that opportunity to share and make a disclosure. And then when you know, then you have to do something about it.
Thank you, Maria. And I just want to check in, Becky or Iman, if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
It's a very difficult like question to just suddenly like have a, because I wish I could have an answer that would suddenly like solve all of the problems, if you know what I mean. Because I personally think that there's a giant stigma around talking about this kind of content, and the kind of assumption that it will like suddenly increase like a suicide rate, or people will suddenly go off and have like a kind of adverse reaction to it. But as somebody who's personally had and been involved in that kind of space for a long time, there is something genuinely really cathartic about being able to talk about it. And as Maria said, like this YAG specifically was one of the first ones that just genuinely asked and was interested in knowing my experience, rather than using it for something. Like they just wanted to know.
Yeah.
There was no like, and I'm going to do XYZ with it. It was just, can you tell us about your experience, rather than this kind of like giant checklist of what they would do with said experience kind of stuff. So I think not that like not that I can be a source of like, well, Becky said blah blah blah, but yeah, I definitely think that you're right, and that it's just about kind of talking to people who have those kind of assumptions and feel that kind of way, and ask if they've actually like done any research about that kind of topic, like like to try and figure out where it is that they're getting that kind of information from, that they assume that that's what happens. I think if you were able to ask them about that and then talk to them about, like, the work that Maria has mentioned by Joe Lockwood and that kind of stuff, and just kind of present them the research that you've got that shows the other side of things, I think sometimes that will help kind of challenge the kind of assumption. But it definitely isn't something that's going to change overnight, and it will require people to do what we're doing right now and talk about it.
There's something about leaning into the conversations that might feel scary for some people, isn't
Yeah,
it? The
completely.
curiosity of asking when you don't know what answers you might get. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna see, Iman, is there anything you would like to share, whether it's related to that question or anything else, before we close up today?
I was just going to say, I think it just comes back to the idea of creating a safe space and having open communication, as Becky said. And I think the YAG has always been very successful in that. And that's why we've been able to avoid that question in itself, where we've always been successful in creating a safe space and making sure that we have that conversation way earlier on. And I guess that may be something that we've done right that's kind of helped us avoid that. And also coming back to also having youth leads as buffers and middlemen, and having those people who you're comfortable with, who you can go to if you're not comfortable going to the researcher. So, yeah.
Thank you, Iman. Wonderful. I think now is about time for us to start to wrap up. I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes left, but I guess firstly, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us. And I found it really interesting to hear about how the YAG, of Youth Advisory Group, was set up. I think hearing about the roles, the importance of, Becky's role, for example, that trust that has been built up amongst the group. I think hearing about the challenges and actually what you've learned from the challenges, and the impact of the My GP guide, which we put several times in the chat, but we will also follow up with a link to that as well, and how that was formed, and the impact. And Maria, thank you for sharing about the impact that's had and been having. So thank you. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for reflecting